Well, first of all, thank you so much to Lisbeth and all the organizers of this splendid conference. I've been really enjoying it. I've changed my title from Channel Crossings to North Sea Crossings because I finally got the geography of the North Sea and the Channel correct in order to write this paper. So North Sea Crossings and the Transformations of 11th century Literary Culture, Saint-Bertin and Classicism. Among the most striking features of the literature of the long 12th century is classicism, both learned clerical classicism and the investment made by the laity in using the classical past to understand and explore their own experience. This paper will use the Encommium, a well-known text written for the English Queen Emma by a monk of Saint-Bertin, to raise questions about the place of Saint-Bertin in the history of classicism in the long 12th century. Alongside this text, it will consider other texts written at Saint-Bertin and also the community's links with the canons of Saint-Omer and of Reims to open up the contribution of Saint-Bertin to the distinctive classicism which flourished in northern France and England in the 11th and 12th centuries. I apologize for leaving out the Vita Ædwardi, also likely written by a monk of Saint-Bertin, but when I was writing my abstract, I bit off way more than I could chew in 20 minutes. In essence, this paper will flip the orientation of my 2017 monograph, there we go, which argued for the agency of English royal women's literary patronage in this space. And now I want to try and open up the agency of the monks of Saint-Bertin. The paper aims to highlight the integral place of Flanders alongside England and France in the innovations of 11th century literary culture, whose most famous proponents, Marbod, Hildebert, Baudry, and Godfrey, the so-called Loire poets, are seen as distinctively French. I want to think about the consequences for literary culture at the start of the long 12th century of the well-studied links between Flanders, especially Saint-Bertin, between Flanders, England, and France. In this paper, as I did in my book, I will focus on classicism in terms of the reception of poetry, specifically to today, Virgil and Horace. And in some ways, this is a weakness, since it does not bring into play the importance of Roman history writing, especially for the Encommium Sallust, but it does mean that we are looking at the announced classical intertext for the Encommium, Virgil's Aeneid, and also its very obvious debt to Horace. Our focus on poetry will also let us look, however glancingly, at how classicism opened up a space for theorizing fiction, another of the major literary developments of the 11th and 12th century associated with these Loire poets. I've earlier argued that the Encommium and the Vita Ædwardi were left out of English literary history because they weren't English enough, written for Norman Emma and half-Danish Edith by Flemings in Latin. They just don't fit into nationalizing literary history. I think the same is true thinking about why they have not been sufficiently mined as texts that have much to offer in understanding of Flemish literary culture. They're too English. But transregionalism is a central feature of literary culture in this period. And the Encommium, as with the Vita Ædwardi, but not today, is an underexplored resource for thinking about the literary culture of Saint-Bertin. The structure of the paper will involve looking at an episode from the Encommium in light of roughly contemporary texts from Saint-Bertin by Folcard and Beauveau. We will finish with an odd, but I hope interesting move and skip ahead to the early 12th century and Lambert of Saint-Omer's wonderful Liber Flores. The Encommium was written at the behest of Queen Emma, Norman princess, who married first the English Ethelred and then the Danish conqueror Canute. The encomiast was a monk of Saint-Bertin working within the Anglo-Danish court between 1040 and 1042. And that is, he was working at the tail end of violently factional years, which marked the end of Canute's reign. And in all of this violence, Emma is fully implicated. His text brazenly gives an account of recent events, which was full of blatant fabrications. And he gives this account to the leading players in the account. So he knows that they know. Worried about how to understand this, he turns to theoretical thinking about classicism and fiction. We're going to plunge straight into one of the text prefaces to illustrate how the text represents a meeting point of the two classicisms I was talking about above, clerical learning and lay people, including lay people like Emma, who are not literate but knew the Roman story world and used it to understand contemporary history, and in this case, to actively promote the Anglo-Danish dynasty. Sorry. Next slide. Okay. I'm going to begin with one long quote, but it's going to provide us for material for the rest of the paper. So we're not going to wait, we won't be wasting our time in having such a long quote at the beginning. Let's read it in English. But you will admit that this is the case, that the book is devoted to praise of Emma, and allow that I nowhere deviate from her praises, if you wisely compare the beginning with the middle, the end with the beginning, and the end with the beginning. And that no cloud of error may hinder your understanding of this, you may take the following as an illustration from similar and entirely true matters. Who can deny that the Aeneid, written by Virgil, is everywhere devoted to praises of Octavian, although practically no mention of him by name, or clearly very little, is seen to be introduced? Note, therefore, that the praise accorded to his family everywhere celebrates the glory of their fame and renown to his honor. Who can deny that this book is entirely devoted to praise of the Queen, since it is not only written to her glory, but since that subject occupies the greatest part of it? If that does not seem probable to you, let it be established by clear proof afforded by another matter. And I want you to remember this circle. It's going to come back at the end of the paper. You are aware that wherever you draw a circle, first of all, you certainly appoint, I have cut and paste problem there. Anyway, now I've lost my place. So you certainly make a point at the beginning, so the circle is made to return by continuously wheeling its orb, and by this return, the circumference of the circle is made to connect itself to its own beginning. By similar connection, therefore, the praise of the Queen is evident at the beginning, thrives in the middle, is present at the end, and embraces absolutely all of what this book amounts to. First, this passage is a very in-your-face invocation of Virgil's Aeneid as a model for the encomiast's account of the Anglo-Danish dynasty. He follows through in the text, representing Svein as Anchises and Canute as Aeneas, founding a new empire. The move is inflected through the concerns of the English, who famously eschew Trojan origins, so that Aeneas is a model, but never an ancestor for the newly founded dynasty. We should be in no doubt that the lay audience knew Virgil mattered to the encomium. Second, on a more sophisticated level, the encomiast also explores the fictionality of the Aeneid as a model for his own text, as a way of theorizing the very obvious fabrications he makes about Emma and Canute. As a keen reader of Servius, he knows that Virgil had frequently and deliberately departed from history, and he develops a sophisticated, though sometimes conflicted, meta-narrative about fiction, in which he often appeals to classical poets. Third, and this is where we're going to pause a bit here, and will help us follow through in the rest of the paper, the encomiast also turns to Horace, not just Virgil, but to Horace, to explain how his text will make meaning. We see this in his double reference to the relationship of the beginning, middle, and end of his texts. He uses this Horatian move. Tricky to, sorry, there we go. He uses this Horatian move to alert the reader to the patterned and artificial nature of his narrative, as Horace wrote of Homer. And so skillfully does he invent, so closely does he blend facts and fiction, that the middle is not discordant with the beginning, nor the end with the middle. Horace, using the language of lying for fiction, represents pattern as a marker of fictionality. It's fascinating to see the encomiast thinking of Homer and Horace, as well as Virgil. Keep these two in mind, they will reappear. Although the encomiast will offer a narrative that, like history writing and unlike the Aeneid, follows the chronological order of events, he instructs his audience to read with attention to form, and indeed form carries a heavy burden in the way he conveys the text's meaning. He's learned from Horace. This passage, with its simultaneously overt and more subtle recourse to Roman poets, reminds us how important the collision of clerical and lay classicisms are to innovative uses of the Roman story world. For now, I'm going to set aside the image of the circle here, but we will come back to it. It is important, if puzzling. In understanding the resources the encomiast brought to his commission, two of the few texts written at Saint-Bertin around 1050 are useful. We'll look first at Folcard's Life of Saint-Bertin. Folcard himself later would leave Saint-Bertin for England, where he found refuge not only with clerics, but with an English queen, either Edward's Edith or William's Matilda. Rosalind and Love and I have both independently discussed the use of Horace in the Vita's prologue, which is addressed to Folcard's abbot Beauvau, who set him the task of writing the text. The prologue style recalls in some ways the dense elusiveness of the Encomium's prefaces. At the end of the prologue, Folcard casts his abbot as an alter Aristarchus, a second Aristarchus. Aristarchus of Samothrace was head of the library in Alexandria and known for his grammatical and literary scholarship, among which was a critical edition of Homer. In invoking Aristarchus, Folcard makes lavish allusion to Horace's Ars Poetica, echoing many of its phrases as he invites Beauvau to revise his text. Beauvau would have been a receptive reader of the invocation of Aristarchus, and perhaps we should see Folcard jokingly, as Rosalind sees this passage, figuring himself here as a second Homer. This move reminds me of the encomiast playing with the roles of Virgil and Octavian, which we discussed earlier. Folcard's far more sober prefaces to his lives of John of Beverley and Botwulf of Thorney, written for the Archbishop Ealdred of York and Bishop Wacklin of Winchester, respectively, illustrate how audience as well as genre are instrumental in making a space for a monk of Saint-Bertin to explore classicism. Beauvau himself produced an Inventio et Elevatione Sancti Bertani after 1052 to mark the elevation of the controversially new discovered relics of the saint. This fascinating text participates fully in the delicate negotiation that Inventiones staged with historical credibility, an issue that was of pressing concern to the encomiast as well, as we know. Monica Otter writes very insightfully about this genre and fictionality, and thinks across the North Sea as she does so. Of particular relevance here in thinking about classicism and fiction is the ecclesiastical network within which Beauvau was so anxious to situate his work. The Inventio's preface includes an exchange of letters between Beauvau and Guy of Châtillon, Archbishop of Reims, who performed the translation. Responding to skepticism and counterclaims about the discovery of the relics, Beauvau seeks to legitimize his account of Guy's authority, with Guy's authority. In the context of our concern for literary history, Beauvau's appeal to the superior learning of Guy and the canons of the Cathedral of Reims is striking. Although we cannot know whether this letter exchange was authentic or fabricated, as Karen Rouget has pointed out, we can register the aim of Beauvau to associate the learning of his monastery with that of Reims and its famous cathedral school. It was precisely under Guy that the school of Reims began to regain the prestige it had had under Gerbert of Aurillac at the end of the 10th century. Then Reims was famous for the study of classical literature and the cultivation of history writing, rhetoric, poetry. Think of Vicher's Ciceronianism here. Presumably, Godfrey of Reims, who is among the classicizing Loire poets I mentioned at the start of my paper, was a young man at the cathedral school about the time that Folcard and Beauvau were writing, since he appears as a master there around 1060. I think prosopographical work on the ties between Reims and Saint-Bertin could be very illuminating for our understanding of literary history. Those networks are, I think, more important for North Sea literary culture than we've realized. I would like to make one more point about Beauvau's Inventio and the Encommium. Both use the device of letters to deflect doubt about controversies. We've seen the Guy and Beauvau exchange. Beauvau also includes within the body of his text an exchange between Guy and Drogo, Bishop of Terrange, addressing the difficult matter of there already being relics of Saint-Bertin in the abbey. The encomiast, meanwhile, quotes in full a letter within his text, the letter which lured Emma and Ethelred's son Alfred back to England, where he was murdered. He claims that the letter was not genuinely from Emma, but forged by Harold, son of Canute, and his other wife, Elgifu of Northampton. Inventio, as invention rather than discovery, is at stake in all of these real or made-up letters. At this point, I could bring in Goscelin, but he is a bit younger, well-studied, and I think more relevant to the Vita Ædwardi. I'd like instead to fly a kite and suggest that the early 12th century Liber Floridus, made by Lambert, the canon of Saint-Omer, could be a useful resource for us. This will seem initially unlikely to anyone who knows that manuscript. Lambert is fascinated, repetitively so, with ancient history, including Roman. There is, however, nothing classicizing about his representation of Rome. Even though he includes poetry by Hildebert, Marbode, and Petrus Pictor, in fact, his selections from these poets bear out the point about his not classicizing. Our quotation from the Encommium and its compass, compassed on circle with Emma in the middle, however, might hint that there is a connection. Now we actually get some pretty pictures after sitting with that boring slide for a while. How to introduce the amazing Liber Floridus in 30 seconds. What can I say? It's an ambitious encyclopedia crossing many domains of learning in which Lambert works as much visually, and this will be important, as textually. I have just a few pictures here. They're all circles, and the importance here is that circles are a visual thematic tool which Lambert uses to draw together his complex manuscript. They are ways of thinking conceptually. And we see here, I've chosen on purpose, the circle on the left encompasses the 6 ages of man as a narrative in pie shapes. And then next one, we have heavenly Jerusalem in a circle. And here we have the most famous circle of the manuscript, the large zone map of the world. I could have spent my entire time just showing you pictures in circles, which we're not going to do. So circles were a way of thinking conceptually. Lambert used the libraries of both his foundation of Our Lady and of the monastery of Saint-Bertin. The monks of Saint-Bertin also produced a very closely related encyclopedia, of which only trace remains in the charred cotton fragments. This was a much smaller and simpler affair, not illustrated, at least as far as we can tell from those charred remains, except for a plan of Jerusalem, which was inevitably circular. Lambert and the monks of Saint-Bertin were working collaboratively on their encyclopedic thinking, and the resources of the monastery's famous library were central. In the passage I quoted earlier, the extended, technical, and precise description of a drawing of a circle with a compass with Emma in the middle is kind of skipped over. This is a passage that has baffled me since I was working on my book. I hunted high and low for textual parallels and came up with nothing. Then in 2016, book proofs done, I spent an afternoon with the Liber Floridus in Ghent Library. I had looked at it in an online facsimile many times, but I had completely overlooked the possible significance of its image of Augustus, found on folio 138 verso for the Encommium. Remember, Emma in the circle comes just after the encomiast has cast her as Octavian and himself as Virgil. I wondered if that image of Augustus had anything to tell us about my circle with Emma in it. It is visual thinking transposed into words, which was visual thinking transposed into words. The image occurs as part of a 6 Ages of Man text, which works as a transition between the 5th and the 6th ages. There are strong verbal connections between this text and the related but much shorter text in the cotton fragments. Déroulé, on whose work, of course, I'm reliant here, describes the 2 texts as apparente, related. The verbal links encourage us to keep the image in play in thinking about the Augustus portrait in relation to Saint-Bertin. There are also, and moreover, links both verbal and thematic between the Liber Floridus's 6 Ages text and the Encommium. Both texts include a couplet, which has now disappeared. It's okay. We will stay with this. The couplet is nicely indicated with an arrow, but I have lost the slide, the couplet on it, not to worry about it. Both texts include a couplet which they attribute to Virgil, which reads in English, "It rains all night, but the public games duly take place in the morning. You, Caesar, hold divided empire with Jove." Meanwhile, the Liber Floridus text is interested in Caesar's sending out of learned men to measure the empire, and mapping is a theme that is evident both visually and textually in the Augustus portrait, as you can see, for example, in the world in his orb. Lambert uses it in the context of Octavian succeeding Julius Caesar, while in the Encommium, this couplet appears as Canute succeeds his father Svein as imperator over 5 kingdoms, Denmark, England, Britain, Scotland, and Norway. The couplet is rare, though not obscure. It appears in Lives of Virgil written in late antiquity, but it is interesting that here it is combined with a thematic overlap between the 2 texts. Furthermore, within the Liber Floridus, the couplet and the image of Augustus are preceded by an extended description of the Roman conquest of Britain, another thematic link to the Encommium. What I'm wondering, and these are just the very beginnings of trying to play with this, what I'm wondering here is if there is an illustrated text, perhaps part of a 6 Ages of Man text at Saint-Bertin, which the Encommius knew and drew on, as also Lambert would do some 6 decades later, though he does something very different with it. It's worth remembering here that early in the 11th century, under Abbot Odbert, and for several decades after, Saint-Bertin was famous for its illustrated manuscript. To conclude briefly, I hope I've convinced you of the importance of integrating Flanders, England, and France, crossing the North Sea, in writing the literary history of the long 12th century. This is an argument which comes into even sharper focus when the Vita Ædwardi is brought into the picture. Written for Queen Edith, likely by a monk of Saint-Bertin, it was on the cutting edge of the development of Loire poetics, but that's another paper. Thank you.